Hi there. I'm just going to start the slideshow, and I'm glad to be chatting with you guys again today. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about personhood, and I wanted to take a moment to orient you to the three separate readings I assigned for week 6. You're going to hear from Peter Singer, who is a utilitarian ethicist out at Princeton, and you're going to hear from Harriet McBride Johnson, who was a disability rights advocate who actually engaged Peter Singer in a public debate, and you're going to read a short snippet of her views of Singer. And then you're going to read a little bit by Eva Feder-Kate, who is a caregiving ethicist and the mother of a child with significant disabilities. And she talks about some of her views around personhood. And in her more recent work, she's starting to speak with regard to Singer's work as well. And just to talk a little bit about the opening slide, that is my dog Bailey, who is one of 2 dogs. I mentioned Archie in class. And the reason I have Bailey on the opening slide is because, as you're going to see in a minute, Singer would argue that Bailey, my dog, was more likely to meet the threshold for personhood than my son. But why do we talk about personhood? Um, as the video I shared on the Crash Course Philosophy short snippet on personhood mentions, personhood a, is something we think about because we are more likely to vigorously protect the lives of people or of bodies who meet the threshold of personhood, and we are more likely to be comfortable ending the life or preventing the life of bodies that we do not see as meeting the threshold for personhood. And part of our understanding of personhood is heavily influenced by this guy, who's René Descartes, a French philosopher who lived and wrote in the late 1500s and 1600s. And Descartes is most known for really polarizing or separating this idea of mind and body. And Descartes largely saw the body as this machine that was largely responsible for just toting around the brain, which was significantly more important. He is known for this famous saying, cogito ergo sum, which is Latin for I think, therefore I am. And so for Descartes and for many philosophers, as we're going to see even today, personhood is and was based on this act of thinking, of being a thinking thing is actually what he writes about. But this idea of being a self-aware, rational, sentient being. Peter Singer, a utilitarian, offers a very contemporary sort of take on Descartes' valuing of being a thinking thing. As I mentioned, he's an ethicist out at Princeton, and as a utilitarian, he approaches decisions in a way that is meant to maximize happiness and to minimize pain and suffering. And as part of the way he thinks about bodies, he views that some non-humans qualify for personhood because they are rational or self-aware, while some humans actually do not meet that criteria for personhood because they do not meet those societally based definitions of rationality, self-awareness, or sort of intellectual ability. And he also differentiates between members of our species and those who are people. So he would identify that a dog and a human being are separate species, but the dog may be more likely to meet the criteria for personhood because the dog is self-aware than a person with significant intellectual disabilities or, say, a fetus. And again, as I mentioned, this is concerning, or this is something that's important because we are more concerned about taking the life or protecting lives of persons than we are of bodies that do not meet that criteria. Interestingly enough, as I understand, Peter Singer is a vegetarian because he sort of views the taking of life of other species, such as animals to eat, as morally problematic. Again, so he's a utilitarian, maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. So along this vein, as a result, Singer argues that some human bodies, such as very young infants, people with cognitive disabilities, so that would include people with significant intellectual disabilities, as well as, say, people with dementia and, of course, fetuses, do not meet the criteria for personhood. Based on his criteria for personhood, even a young infant would not meet that threshold. And he would argue that in the case of, say, significant intellectual disability, it is not morally wrong to take the life of that child because he sees that life as more likely to experience significant pain and suffering than to experience happiness. And as a result, I think even in your chapter, you will find direct references to saying that it is not morally inappropriate to end the life of a disabled infant. McBride Johnson is a disability rights advocate who took considerable exception to Peter Singer's views and engaged him in a public debate in 2002. And I just wanted to give you a few moments of just introduce you to McBride Johnson and the other person who we're going to read who offers opposing ways to consider personhood again, in terms of disability rights conversations. So Harriet McBride Johnson was a disability rights advocate. She lived from 1957 to 2008. She had a significant neuromuscular disorder. As a result, you'll see her in a power wheelchair in an image on your screen. She was also a lawyer and a very active disability rights activist. In 1990, she was known for speaking out against Jerry's Kids. And for those of you, I think in your generation, you may not be familiar with Jerry's Kids, but Jerry Lewis was a famous actor and comedian who had an annual telethon on Labor Day. I can remember watching it when I was a very young person. And these days we would look at it and say that this is a significant example of inspiration porn. It was basically 24 hours of these tragic and inspiring videos of children living with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, a condition that causes significant neuromuscular degeneration and early death. And he used this telethon to raise significant funds in an attempt to find a cure. I'm not sure when the telethons ended, but they did. And these days, disability rights advocates would have significant concerns about using this sort of inspiration porn and charitable model to raise funds for research for disabilities and in particular for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. In 2002, she engaged in a public debate with Peter Singer, and I'm not going to go into it here because it's fairly clearly sort of laid out in your book. She discusses some of her key arguments with Singer. What I'm hoping you'll do is read that chapter, and then we can talk a little bit about the Singer-McBride Johnson debate. I'm also hoping that you'll look at Eva Feder-Katay's work. Next slide here. This is an image of Eva Feder-Katay, her daughter, and a caregiver. And Sesha, her daughter, which is the woman using a wheelchair, lives with significant intellectual and physical disability. And Eva Feder-Katay is a philosopher. And I believe these days she's retired, but she was at Stony Brook University in the States. She is most known for her work in caregiving ethics. So she talks a great deal about the human how most humans are dependent and that we all experience interdependence and dependency, which can shift throughout the life. She talks a lot about caregiving and about the sort of the demands of caregiving and how we protect both people who require care and people who provide care. And we are attentive to the ethical and power-based issues within these relationships. She is turning her attention, or in some of her more recent work, is looking at the issue of personhood, specifically with regard to Peter Singer. But she also looks at personhood. She asks us to think about personhood in very different ways in terms of interdependency rather than rationality. And I felt that it was an interesting and important counterpart to some of the other discussions that were engaging. I think one of the things that might be interesting to explore, so while Peter Singer would have advocated that ending Harriet McBride Johnson's life as a young infant was morally appropriate, certainly Harriet McBride Johnson meets the criteria of personhood in terms of cognitive capacity or self-awareness, whereas Eva Feder-Kate is asking us to think about human beings and persons who do not meet those criteria, do not meet that threshold that um, Singer sort of puts out for discussion. So I think she asks us to think about caregiving and personhood and interdependency in yet new and interesting and compelling ways that allow us to challenge or think through Singer um, yet again in different ways. Anyway, I'm going to stop here. I just wanted to take a moment to introduce you to these three different perspectives. And I'm looking forward to our conversation in class where we can spend time unpacking this sort of very challenging topic of personhood and these three different perspectives and how they inform our understanding. I'm also hoping you'll have watched the Crash Course Philosophy 9-minute video because it's just a really good way of giving you a very quick summary of the issue of personhood and why it matters. And it does provide a quick overview of Singer again. Thanks again. We'll talk soon.